Kazakhstan is one of those places that doesn't make headlines until something breaks. But if you look at the map, you realize it sits at the exact center of the 21st century geopolitical chessboard, a place where Russia's insecurity meets China's ambition, and where the United States suddenly finds new reasons to get involved. Welcome to Global Risk Profile, where we break down the headlines that matter and the ones that should. Kazakhstan is the world's largest landlocked country, the 9th largest country on Earth, a state that shares a nearly 7,600-kilometer border with Russia and a sensitive frontier with Xinjiang in China. It's rich in minerals, hydrocarbons, and uranium. It's the hub for the east-west rail lines and the north-south energy corridors. It's a Muslim-majority country that is stable, pragmatic, and deeply allergic to ideological extremes. And it's a post-Soviet republic that has never fully trusted Moscow and never fully embraced Beijing. Kazakhstan is the place where all the contradictions of Eurasia meet. And right now, those contradictions are sharpening. Russia seems weaker and more unpredictable than at any point in 30 years. China is wealthier, more assertive, and more embedded in Central Asian infrastructure than ever before. And the United States, after decades of strategic distraction, suddenly needs Kazakhstan for minerals, supply chains, and geopolitical stability. This isn't a story about a small country caught in the middle. It's a story about a medium-sized power trying to stay sovereign in a world where its two giant neighbors are pulling in opposite directions. To understand where this collision is heading, we need to understand first what Kazakhstan actually is, how it came to be, what it remembers, and what it fears, and what choices each leadership believes it has. Kazakhstan is not an invented post-Soviet state. Its political and cultural foundation stretch back centuries. Nomadic confederations, the Kazakh Khanate, complicated diplomacy with Russia, China, and the steppe powers. But the trauma that defines modern Kazakhstan comes from the 20th century. Under Soviet rule, Kazakhstan became a laboratory for some of the USSR's most catastrophic policies. Collectivization caused a famine in the 1930s that killed between 1/4 and 1/3 of all Kazakhs, one of the worst demographic collapses of the century, percentage-wise. Forced settlements of nomads transformed the entire structure of Kazakh society, and massive in-migration of Russians turned Kazakhs into a minority in their own republic by the 1970s. These memories still shape Kazakhstan's foreign policy today. And no part of Kazakhstan's modern identity makes the country more wary of foreign domination than the legacy of the Semipalatinsk nuclear test site, the epicenter of Soviet nuclear experimentation from 1949 to 1989. The USSR detonated 456 nuclear devices there, many above ground, exposing an estimated of 1.5 to 2 million people to radiation. Entire communities suffered elevated rates of cancer, birth defects, immune disorders, and multi-generational health impacts that continue today. The tests were conducted with little regard for local life or long-term consequences. Villagers were not evacuated, and in some cases, Soviet scientists even monitored civilians' radiation exposure as data points. For Kazakhstan, Semipalatinsk is not abstract history. It's a national trauma that shaped the instinct to avoid dependence on any external power capable of treating Kazakhs as expendable. This history makes the parallel with China's nuclear testing in nearby Xinjiang especially sensitive. From 1964 to 1996, China detonated 45 nuclear devices at Lop Nur, 22 in the open air, over lands inhabited by Uyghurs and ethnic Kazakhs who were never warned, never evacuated, and still carry the fallout in their bones. In both cases, large empires used peripheral, minority-inhabited regions as safe spaces for the most dangerous experiments. This stands in stark contrast to an earlier model of imperial governance in the same geographical sphere. The approach of Emperor Taizong of the Tang Dynasty over 1,000 years ago, who deliberately incorporated frontier tribes in that area as partners rather than subjects, recruiting them into leadership, respecting their customs, and treating peripheral peoples not as disposable buffers, but as integral pillars of stability. So, when Kazakhstan became independent in 1991, it didn't just inherit borders, it inherited a memory of vulnerability, of what happens when a distant capital controls your economy, your land, and your future. Thus, since the 1990s, the country has rebuilt itself with a core idea: never again be dependent on any single great power, especially one that shares a border with you. After independence in 1991, Kazakhstan faced a unique strategic challenge: how to survive between Russia, China, and the West while keeping space for its own identity. The solution became the foundation of its foreign policy: the multi-vectored strategy. Engage everyone and align with no one, and always keep options open. It's similar to India's doctrine of strategic autonomy, but Kazakhstan has far less room for error. India has oceans, now it has nuclear deterrence and deep markets. Kazakhstan has none of those, only vast steppe and long borders. Where India can afford assertiveness, Kazakhstan practices quiet, careful balance, adjusting constantly to shifts in Moscow, Beijing, and Washington. Kazakhstan's political system is strongly presidential. It's run by technocrats, engineers, economists, foreign policy specialists who operate with a managerial mindset. Parliament exists, but real power flows through the presidency, the security services, and networks of elites who value stability above all else. Kazakhstan has also built a new identity through modernization and nation building, often in strikingly visible ways. The capital city itself, Astana, was constructed largely from scratch on the southern steppe in the late 1990s as a symbol of a rising nation. It was later renamed Nur Sultan in honor of the founding 30-year longtime president Nur Sultan Nazarbayev, and then renamed back to Astana in 2022. Its architectural ambition is a futuristic city meant to anchor Kazakhstan's place in the world. At the heart of the capital sits Nazarbayev University, founded in 2010, to create a world-class institution built on Western academic standards. Kazakhstan recruited accomplished faculty from the US, Europe, Canada, and East Asia, formed partnerships with Cambridge, Stanford, UPenn, and others, and made English its language of instruction. The university now serves as a training ground for Kazakhstan's next generation of technocrats, a deliberate shift away from dependence on Russian educational models. Culturally, Kazakhstan is changing just as quickly. The country is now majority urban. Almaty and Astana feel global. English is growing, and Kazakh's nationalism is rising, confident, moderate, and distinct from the heavy-handed identity politics elsewhere in the region. Islam remains Sufi-inflected and culturally grounded. Society is modernizing, but still anchored in the communal values inherited from nomadic life. Meanwhile, demographic recovery has transformed national identity. Kazakhs, who were a minority in their own republic in the late Soviet period, are now around 70% of the population. That shift fuels cultural revival, but also heightens sensitivity to sovereignty, language, and the country's history. And then we overlay all of this with geography. A nearly 7,600-kilometer border with Russia, a frontier with Xinjiang, oil and gas fields that connect Kazakhstan to global markets, and rail corridors that are critical to China's Belt and Road. Let's talk about Russia now. Russia sees Kazakhstan as part of its strategic depth, a buffer that protects Russia's vulnerable southern flank, and a zone where Moscow expects political loyalty even without formal control. The two countries share one of the world's longest borders, as we've said. Kazakhstan's northern regions contain large ethnic Russian populations, Russian power grids supply Kazakh cities. Russian ports and pipelines carry Kazakh oil. Russian transit routes shape Kazakh exports and imports. This interdependence isn't an accident, it's by design. And it seems that when Russia feels weak, it increases the pressure. For Moscow, Kazakhstan is becoming more strategically important for three reasons. First, sanctions. Russia increasingly uses Kazakhstan as a channel for acquiring goods it can't buy directly: electronics, components, machinery. This makes Kazakhstan both valuable and vulnerable. Next is energy. Russia controls key pipelines and processing plants. Any dispute can instantly cripple Kazakhstan's exports. And third, the politics. The January 2022 unrest in Kazakhstan, quelled with help from Russian troops, created a narrative in Moscow that current President Tokayev's stability depends on Russian support. Astana disputes that, but the perception matters. Russia's message to Kazakhstan is clear: you may want to diversify, but you will always need us. Kazakhstan's message back is equally clear: we will cooperate, but we will not be absorbed. The problem for Astana is that Russia's weakness can be just as dangerous as Russia's strength. A cornered Kremlin may try to reassert dominance in Central Asia to prove it still matters. And Kazakhstan, with its long borders and complex demographics, may sit at the top of that list. But China's rise complicates Moscow's calculations. For Beijing, Kazakhstan is not a nostalgic project. It's a strategic linchpin, a trade corridor, an economic partner, and the outer buffer of China's most sensitive region, Xinjiang. Every land route of the Belt and Road that links China to Europe starts in or passes through Kazakhstan. Pipelines, rail lines, and the Kyrgyz dry port bind the two economies together, moving oil, gas, metals, and manufactured goods in both directions. Kazakhstan provides space, access, and stability, all things China cannot buy domestically. But the relationship becomes more complicated the closer you get to the border. China's central government defines stability in Xinjiang not simply as economic growth or public order, but as tight political control, cultural conformity, and security-first governance. This has included mass detention centers, forced labor, surveillance system, restrictions on religions and cultural practices, coercive labor programs, and growing evidence of organ harvesting. These policies directly affect roughly 1.5 to 1.8 million ethnic Kazakhs inside China in Xinjiang, many of whom have family ties across the border. This puts Kazakhstan in a uniquely delicate position. Pressured by China's economic weight on one side and pressured by its own public's concern for Kazakhs on the other side. Astana never confronts Beijing publicly, but it never stops negotiating privately. The economic embrace China is now giving Kazakhstan means it's now become its largest trading partner. It surpassed Russia in 2024, and its investments have surged by some measures more than 400% in early 2025. Much of this is infrastructure: oil and gas pipelines, logistics hubs, rail corridors, mineral extraction projects, and industrial zones linked to Belt and Road. Where Russia uses leverage bluntly, China uses scale and economic integration. Every new railway or pipeline makes Kazakhstan more connected and more dependent. Despite the economic boom, tensions remain real. When it comes to water, China controls the upstream flow of major rivers that Kazakhstan depends on, much like India and other countries in Southwest Asia. There are rumors of elites selling land to China that trigger protests. Whether they're completely true or not, we know that from other countries that's been happening. And also, Kazakhstan is wary of being overshadowed by a much larger power, and xenophobic narratives find quick traction. Also, Beijing expects Kazakhstan to keep its side of the border calm, especially after the unrest of 2022. But Astana resists becoming an extension of Chinese security policy. The deeper Beijing moves into Kazakhstan's economy, the more threatened Moscow feels. Russia wants Kazakhstan aligned with it. China wants Kazakhstan open up to itself, while Kazakhstan wants room to maneuver. Chinese rail lines to the west bypass Russian territory. Chinese mineral projects dilute Russian control. And Chinese capital offers an alternative to Russian leverage. And as Russia weakens under sanctions, China advances, quietly but relentlessly. This is why Kazakhstan is a true collision point between the two Eurasian giants. China may not be trying to replace Russia, but its economic footprint inevitably erodes Moscow's influence, and Moscow knows it. And into this triangle, a third power is stepping back in, the United States. For most of the 3 decades after independence, Kazakhstan lived in a geopolitical triangle dominated by Russia and then China, with the United States watching from a distance. Washington focused on Afghanistan, energy investment, and non-proliferation, not on Central Asian geopolitics. That era is over. Over the past few years, 3 structural shifts have pushed the US back into Kazakhstan. The first, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, reopened the Eurasian question. For 30 years, the US assumed Russia's influence in Central Asia was stable but manageable. The invasion changed that. Washington now sees Russia's coercive use of pipelines, electricity, and border controls, Russia's interest in Kazakhstan as a sanctions evasion hub, and the danger of a weakened, unpredictable Russia on Kazakhstan's doorstep. Kazakhstan is no longer a peripheral state, but a strategic buffer whose sovereignty directly affects Eurasian stability. The second shift, China's Belt and Road, has made Kazakhstan the keystone of the Eurasian land routes. Kazakhstan is essential to the BRI rail network. Up to 8,000 trains a year travel between China and Europe. Roughly 80% of China-Europe rail traffic passes through Kazakhstan at the China-Kazakhstan border crossings. Freight volume through the Middle Corridor increased by over 80% in 2022 alone, and Chinese investment in Kazakhstan rose 400% in early 2025, according to official trade figures. Washington cannot ignore a country that sits at the choke point of the largest infrastructure project of its main competitor. And the third shift, global industry needs to decouple from China's mineral and materials dominance. This is the most strategic driver of all. That is because Kazakhstan is the world's largest uranium producer, about 43% of global output, a rising source of rare earth adjacent metals, and home to major deposits of copper, chromium, titanium, and beryllium. And it's also potentially a processing hub if Western capital steps in. Meanwhile, China controls 60 to 70% of global rare earth mining and 80 to 90% of rare earth processing. And it has a dominant share in other metals midstream production. For Washington, building non-China supply chains means partnering with the handful of countries, including Kazakhstan, that have serious mineral reserves and relative political stability. Analysts at RAND, the Atlantic Council, and the New Lines Institute all note that the US increasingly sees the Trans-Caspian Middle Corridor as the key to reshaping Eurasian logistics. The route runs from China to Kazakhstan, the Caspian Sea, Azerbaijan, Georgia, Turkey, and Europe. Some key numbers. Freight traffic along the corridor grew by roughly 6 to 8x between 2021 and 2023. Transit time is now 13 to 21 days compared to 35 days by sea. Capacity remains limited, but strategic value is rising. So far, US support has been political endorsement, diplomatic coordination, technical assistance on customs harmonization, cooperation with the EU and Turkey, and early-stage investment discussions. It's not massive capital yet, but very deliberate structure building. And now we come to the C5+1 summit. The C5+1 format existed before, But the Washington summit recently elevated it to a new level. Critical minerals, supply chains, and the Middle Corridor were central topics, signaling that Kazakhstan is now part of the US conversation on global economic security, not just regional issues. Now, why is American engagement attractive to Kazakhstan? Unlike Russia, the US does not have territorial expectations, and unlike China, it does not pressure Kazakhstan on domestic security or Xinjiang-related compliance. And unlike both, it's not a neighbor. For Kazakhstan's new Western-educated technocratic elite, the US represents science and technology, higher education, supply chain diversification, global markets, and political breathing room. In other words, diversification without domination. What Washington wants, it seems, is not necessarily influence for its own sake, but the prevention of unilateral influence by others. That is, a Kazakhstan that is not reabsorbed by Russia, and a Kazakhstan that is not monopolized by China, and a secure non-China critical mineral supply chain, and an operational middle corridor, and a stable, sovereign, multi-vector state anchoring Eurasia. The US doesn't need Kazakhstan to join the West. It needs Kazakhstan to retain choices. So what are those choices? If you're sitting in Astana in the presidential administration or the foreign ministry, you don't see Kazakhstan as a chess piece that others move. You see a ridgeline. On the one side, a weakened but dangerous Russia. On the other, a rich but overwhelming China. And behind you, a distant United States that is finally paying attention. Under your feet is a young nation with painful historical memories and a real chance at prosperity. Your job is simple to describe and extremely hard to execute. To keep Kazakhstan sovereign, stable, and growing without triggering a crisis with any of the three giants. The question is not whether Kazakhstan can maintain this balancing act forever. It's whether the leadership sees any alternative to trying at this time. From Astana's vantage point, Russia is the short-term risk that can cause harm instantly, and China is the long-term dependency whose leverage grows quietly over time, and the United States is the optionality provider, helpful but far away. Kazakh elites don't aspire to join a bloc. They aspire not to be trapped in one. If you were to ask Kazakh policymaker where China dependence feels most dangerous, I assume they will point to the following. First, minerals and processing. China dominates the midstream. 2. Transport and logistics. Chinese-funded routes can create systemic reliance. 3. Finance and debt. State-owned enterprises loans can embed long-term leverage. And 4. Digital infrastructure. Huawei-shaped systems reduce autonomy. And Xinjiang spillover. Co-ethnic distress can destabilize domestic politics. Kazakhstan's goal is not to break with China. It might feel that it can't. Its goal at the moment is to add enough alternatives to avoid being cornered. So, how can the United States actually help? Probably in ways that match Kazakhstan's own worldview. There is one deeper lesson American policymakers may sometimes miss about Kazakhstan history, as we have discussed. Every empire that has touched the steppe, Russian, Qing, Soviet, even the early Tang, has faced the same strategic dilemma, whether to rule the frontier through force and extraction or through partnership and respect. And this goes back to where we've mentioned the Chinese Emperor Tang Taizong. Empires that treat frontier peoples as expendable create long-term instability, and those that treat them as partners create legitimacy and room for long-term cooperation. Kazakhstan's leadership does not expect Russia or China today to adopt the early Tang model of inclusive frontier governance, but they do use these historical contrasts to clarify for themselves what they must defend: the ability to remain a partner and not a subject, a state with agency and not a testing ground for someone else's ambitions. For the United States, the implication seems straightforward. If Washington wants to be the most trusted of Kazakhstan's three major partners. It should consistently behave like the only one that treats Kazakhstan as a sovereign nation and partner rather than a buffer or a corridor. That is, build alternatives, not loyalties, like co-financing non-Chinese mineral processing and long-term offtake agreements, or to treat the middle corridor as an actual economic project. Invest in customs harmonization, digital tracking, port upgrades, and rail fixes. And also support non-Chinese digital infrastructure. A diversified telecom and data ecosystem gives Kazakhstan leverage. And respect Kazakhs' red lines. No public ultimatums, no saying with us or against us. And invest in people, like scholarships, training, joint labs, regulatory exchanges, the slow but decisive work of shaping options. The US doesn't necessarily need Astana to choose America right now. It needs Astana to keep the map open, to prevent any one neighbor from sealing its fate. If American policy can give Kazakhstan a few more degrees of freedom and more years of maneuvering space, that is already some success. And that in practice enables Kazakhstan to further distance itself from the CCP. Because in a region where history is full of people who lost the ability to choose, the preservation of choice is gold. That's it for this episode of Global Risk Profile. If you found this useful, thoughtful, or just different, please subscribe, share, and leave a review. And remember, the headlines may change, but the deeper patterns rarely do. Thanks for listening, and stay sharp.